Time for a post OTA best decks roundup. It's definitely early in the format, but honestly, the results and the data and my own personal experience so far make me really optimistic for what's going on in this format. Nothing really has standout win rates above anything else so far, and there's a ton of people trying a ton of different things. Let's go ahead and dig on into all of the old favorites as well as some new gems that are popping up and looking competitive in Marvel Snap. You can tell a Marvel Snap format is healing when Destroy is once again one of the breakout decks. While I wouldn't say Destroy was unplayable in our previous format, it was definitely one of the many decks that was suppressed by the fact that its big numbers struggled to keep up with what Blob was previously bringing to the table. Destroy is back to not only having a healthy win rate and average cube per untapped.gg metric, but also the most popular deck as people gravitate back towards old favorites. They try and figure out this new format. The 12 cards that you have on your screen are fairly similar to most of the Destroy archetypes in rotation, with Arnim Zola definitely being the flex slot that's often replaced by other things like Taskmaster, or even people shoving Scar into this shell so they can get their weekend missions done. Speaking of weekend missions, our second most popular deck per untapped metrics likely related to that, since this is a discard deck featuring Meek. Similar to Destroy, there's a lot of variation in people trying a lot of things with this archetype right now, but it's worth noting that this build featuring Collector and Helicarrier has markedly better stats than a lot of the other builds that are floating around per untapped metrics. I think the big strength that this build has over the more traditional options that are not playing these two cards is Helicarrier and Collector really lets you set up big Modocs on that final turn of the game, so that way you can play Meek into Modoc, discard a bunch of hands, and scale up a bunch of different threats, whether it be Meek, Morbius, Collector, or even your Dracula that's going to finish off your opponent with a big discard. Our third most popular deck per untapped metrics is Bounce. This is definitely an archetype that benefits from the fact that Blob, while still big, is a number that you can compete with. Werewolf and even Sentry can let you go over the top of a 15 to 20 power Blob far easier than can go over the top of a 30 to 40 power Blob that we're dealing with in the previous format. A couple of noteworthy things to call out about the Bounce archetype. The first is that overall, these Sentry Annihilus variations of Bounce have the best stats on Untapped, and because Werewolf was pushed up to a 3 energy card a couple of OTAs ago, these best performing builds are all featuring Zabu as a way to get these 4 energy cards into play ahead of curve. Another thing to keep in mind when you're playing against these bounce decks is because that they're playing Zabu for their proactive cards anyways, they're also splashing in those 4 energy reactive cards, i.e. Shang-Chi and Enchantress, so you need to be ready to not only keep up with their numbers, but also for them to be chopping your own down. Our next most popular deck per untapped metrics is this Alioth Galactus Clutter monstrosity the number of other content creators have helped popularize. This deck has really dynamic game plans that make it easy to catch your opponent off guard if they're not prepared for what you're doing. They need to respect your potent tech cards like Shang-Chi when they do have priority, and when they don't have priority, you can blow them away with Alioth. And then the kind of cherry on the cake is that past all of that, they also have to respect the fact that anytime you have an open lane with a goblin in it, there could be a Galactus quickly following it up. If you're going to be playing against this archetype, one of the things you definitely want to look out for is filling up your right side lane as quickly as possible, so that way Sentry's Void can't be kicked across, since that's the biggest negative thing they're frequently putting out to pair with the World Eater. Up next, we have Hela Lockjaw, which just has a plethora of ways to cheat overstated cards into play ahead of their typical 6 energy cost, whether it's Black Knight creating you an Ebony Blade, Dracula bidding 1 at the end of the turn, or the deck's namesake Lockjaw spinning them up directly out of your deck. This deck has a ton of ways past just Hela to get these 6 energy cards into play. One of the things that makes this deck so powerful is the fact that the unpredictability of it makes your opponent have a hard time retreating into it, since they don't fully know what your output range is, and neither do you. If you're someone that likes gambling a little bit while you play Marvel Snap, this is definitely the deck list for you. Our Titan from the previous format is down but not out with the Blob nerf. Thanos Lockdown does still have reasonable stats compared to all of the other decks that I'm listing in this video, but it's no longer head and shoulders above the rest of the formats based on the early data that we have so far, and most notably, the play rate of this deck is about 1/3 of what it was before Blob got adjusted. If you weren't keeping tabs on how this deck worked in the previous format, you play out your Thanos Stones and other cheap cards that play to the board, and then you create this kind of shell game on the sixth and final turn of the game where your opponent has to simultaneously beat multiple different powerful cards. Whether it's an Alioth blowing away their card if you have priority, or a Shang-Chi chopping down their biggest card if you don't have priority. When you mix these in with large statted threats like Blob or Magneto, who can move your opponent's cards around, you often hold all of the decision making as to how much you can disrupt your opponent, while they're left guessing which of your output range they can actually beat. The uncertainty that this deck has on that final turn of the game gives you a lot of cube equity in key spots, since even good players won't always know if it's correct for them to retreat. Next, a more traditional non-Thanos lockdown variation is still plugging along that has a lot of the same strengths of the Thanos deck. While this one is not playing Blob, it has Doctor Doom as an additional final play alongside Alioth and Shang-Chi. That makes it difficult for the opponent to predict what you have going on. This deck list also gets to leverage Miss Marvel, since it's good at fanning out across the board, letting you play for all three lanes very efficiently. From decks that are most popular on Untapped metrics to ones that have a lot of potential, i.e. smaller sample sizes but strong win rates and average cube gains so far in those samples, we kick things off with Serra Control. This deck list looks to use cost reducers like Serra as well as Zabu to make it so your opponent is not going to be able to predict where you're going to play out your powerful interaction and stats on the final turn of the game. Whether it's blowing your opponent's one drops away with Killmonger, chopping down their large thing with Shang-Chi, or turning off their Iron Man with an Enchantress, these potent tech cards in tandem with efficient stats from a card like Maximus allow you to swing most games in your favor by disrupting whatever your opponent is trying to bring to the table. Our next high potential list is another Serra variation that's far more proactive than the previous one. This deck list is leveraging the Black Knight as well as Ghost Rider to give us double-digit points worth of stats for often just 2 energy once the discounts from Serra and Zabu get applied. One of the big things this archetype has going for it is that Kyeria as well as the Ebony Blade's built-in protection make it incredibly difficult for our opponents to interact with the massive stats that we're putting on the board. Because our deck is playing Serra and Zabu as well, we can also interact with our opponent a little bit with Shang-Chi like this deck list shows, but you can also splash other tech cards like Shadow King and Enchantress in to fit whatever decks you're most interested in beating down. Our next high potential list is one that is extra spicy, but with over a few hundred games logged on the tracker, this Mr. Negative deck actually has one of the highest average cube gains on Untapped so far. This deck list is hitting from a couple of different angles. You can play Wong into a giant Black Panther, into Arnim Zola, blow them across the board to overwhelm your opponent that way, but you can also just do really strong Mr. Negative things where you play Jane Foster and then fish up a bunch of zero cost inverted cards from your deck to have a completely free Iron Man, Arnim, Zola, Null, and even Mystique to copy a bunch of the above to make it completely unpredictable not only how many stats you're going to have, but where exactly they're going to end up on the board. We'll close out the high potential category today with a deck list that I feature on my secondary channel recently, and that is the Thor Werewolf deck. I really love what this deck brings to the table. It has such a wide range of just efficient stat sticks, whether it's Thor or Sentry providing 10 stats for minimal resources, or a werewolf jumping around the board, getting up to absolutely massive stat line when Jane Foster fishes up all of our on-reveal zeros for him to chase all around the board. This deck list also has room to fit in a couple of disruptive cards in the form of Spider-Ham, Mobius, and Enchantress, so we're not just cold to whatever strategy our opponent is trying to deploy against us. As always, I'd like to wrap up my best decks video with a couple of my own personal pocket picks that I've been having fun playing and finding success with on the ladder. The first of these is this Bast Patriot deck that I featured on the channel yesterday. Since I was streaming with this and featured it here, it's racked up almost 2,000 matches on the Untapped tracker, and across that pretty significant sample size, it's maintained a very reasonable cube and win rate. This deck list, if you haven't seen it in action, is phenomenal at not only spreading out out wide across the board thanks to cards like Squirgle and Mysterio being 3 bodies in 1, but it can also go tall thanks to Iron Man doubling up whatever lane he's deployed in, while simultaneously being able to cut down whatever our opponents are doing to size thanks to Valkyrie serving double duty of buffing our small ones and shrinking their big ones. If you're looking for a deck list that leverages our latest Dazzler update, this is a phenomenal one that I can't recommend enough. Finally, I know I featured Werewolf Bounce at the start of the video. This is a Jeff Hoagland Best Decks video, so I think we can sneak in a second Bounce deck. This Bast Bounce deck that's much closer to the tried and true classic Bounce deck from before Werewolf existed felt very reasonable and competitive to me when I was grinding up the Infinite Ladder on stream. This deck list is really good at just pumping out solid 20 plus numbers across multiple lanes. In a world where you can now use that stat size to compete with a blob, this deck feels like a real contender again. Similar to the previous Bast list that we just looked at, Dazzler also has a phenomenal home in here. Even if we're only able to fill up 2 lanes, she's still 6 or 7 points of power, which is solidly above rate for what you typically get out of 2 energy. If you want to see this deck in action, it'll be our highlight Monday here on this channel after the weekend is done. Well, I do want to emphasize again, this is an early look at this developing format after the big change that cutting Blob down to size was. I'm super optimistic about the results. It looks like they successfully took a card and reined it in without making it unplayable, while giving breathing room to a bunch of decks that I personally enjoy that are looking to put reasonable numbers into play, such as the Bast Bounce deck that was my second personal pick. I would love to know what you've been finding success with on the ladder or in Conquest in a comment down below. And as always, thanks for making it through to the end of the video. Be sure to snap that like button if you enjoyed my breakdown today, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I post a lot of Marvel Snap content here many days a week, and I'd love to see you back again sometime. Happy snapping, folks.